Okay, we'll go ahead and get going for today. Apologize I couldn't hold the lecture. I actually need to take some family members to the airport. So I wasn't going to be in town and thought maybe instead of canceling the lecture, we can continue with the virtual lecture. I also posted some videos online to kind of speed things up a little bit, make sure that we can get everything done. We're going to be on class 12 today, so you can go ahead and download that zip. Go ahead, download it, get it open. We'll go through some of the old code that's on the video and then start with this new code on class 12. Okay, on the video, if you watched it, you already seen this, but if not, on the end of last class, we got the stack pane set up, we set up the images, we set up the images and the image views, and basically all we had done was set up this timeline here, and in the timeline, all we had was a set rotate function, and we would increment by 6. Okay, so we didn't do too much. We just had a set rotate. I think we had seconds elapsed, and we did plus equals 6 on the inside. And on the videos, I continued it a little bit, not only so you can see the buttons, but so you can get this formula. If I scroll to the top, we also added some new variables. So we had not only seconds elapsed, but tick time in seconds, which was a resolution, and the delta, which was our degrees. We put the timeline as a global variable. Okay, we also added some more buttons. Okay, so we had a V box, and we wanted to make the buttons the same size, so we added 2 buttons to the V box, and we set the max width on them. So for the previous challenge, this is what I was looking for. Having a V box, adding buttons, and then setting the max width to double max value. That's what that last challenge was talking about. Okay, and if I keep going down, we had some set on action. So if they click the start button, it will actually play the timeline. If we click the stop button, it's going to pause the timeline. And we talked about having a reset button as well, which is what you'll need to do for the current challenge. And then our formula is a little bit nicer. Okay, I have seconds elapsed. I'm adding the tick time in seconds. I'm multiplying it by our delta, which is our degrees. Okay, and I call that my rotation value, and I set the rotation to our calculated rotation value. So what we did in the videos, as well as in last class, is we're setting this up, but you can kind of see it's like a C program. Okay, I have this start method, and everything is in the start method. I just kind of go line by line sequentially. And even though that will work, that's not really how Java is supposed to be developed. For Java, we need to have classes. We need to separate the code. We don't want to write any of the same code twice. So that's what we're going to be doing today. So on class 12, if you download the zip, we're going to take what we did in My Stopwatch. We're going to take this functionality, and we're going to turn it into a real Java application by making classes, separating the code, creating variables, calling variables from other classes. Okay, so here I'm going to import class 12. Okay, go ahead and import class 12. We're going to go directly to the code. So if I import class 12 to NetBeans, this is what you're going to see. So I've already created another class, and the first one we're going to open up is the main class, My New Stopwatch.java. Okay, so usually in a JavaFX app, in this main class, all I have is the code to actually start the application. What we did in our previous code is we were trying to focus on the functionality of the stopwatch. Okay, now we're going to take that functionality and make a real Java application. So in the main class, the only thing that should be there is the stuff to actually show the stage, like setting the title, setting the scene. So this main class will actually be very short. I'll have the start method. I'll create an instance of our class. I'll have the scene and I'll show the stage. That's it. Okay, that's what a normal JavaFX app will look like. Okay, Lingy has a question. Will this start work? I mean the C-like code. So that stopwatch will work in the previous code. So if I run the previous code, okay, you're going to see it. Everything's in the start method, so you can think of it like a C program. Everything I just have in the main. Okay, it's going to work as far as running, but it's not going to work for the challenge. I'm sorry about that. Actually, the first challenge, the one that's due, I believe you can put everything in the start method. Here's what it's going to look like. So after you watch the videos, this is what you end up getting. You see I click the start button, it'll start. Click the stop button, it pauses it, and I can start it back up again. So for the first stopwatch, I do believe you can put everything in the start function. For the next challenge, I believe you have to separate everything. Okay, I'm going back to my new stopwatch. We're going to be looking at analogstopwatch.java. So I've made a new class. There's nothing in it. What we want to do is have everything that has to deal with the analog be in this analog class. What students have done in the past is they get the challenge working all in the start method. Okay, so they do a C-like program. Everything's in the start method. Once they have that set up, then they go ahead and start separating the code. So you kind of do one step at a time. Get the functionality working. Once the functionality is working, then start separating it out into a nice Java program. That's a good sequence to do. And even though the C-like program will work in the current challenge, if you go ahead and start separating it out in this challenge, the next challenge will be much easier. Okay, so you can leave it in the start method, but if you do separate it out, the next challenge will be much easier. Okay, so what I'm going to be doing is I'm kind of going to be switching back and forth between my stopwatch and analog stopwatch. To save some time, it's going to be easier to copy what we've done into this analog stopwatch. So for example, if I go into mystopwatch.java, we had some global variables. Okay, we had seconds elapsed, tick time in seconds, and angle, the delta per second. Okay, so I'm going to want these in my other program as well. So right here in the top of analog stopwatch, I'm going to need these variables as well. Okay, but remember, for a good Java program, you're going to want to make these private. Okay, I want to take advantage of data encapsulation. Okay, and the other one we just defined it as public. We're just trying to get the functionality to work. In our analog stopwatch, to make it a more of a Java-like program, okay, these should be private. We should have methods that access these fields. Okay, so we have seconds elapsed, tick time in seconds, and then our delta, which is our degrees. We're also going to want variables such as the timeline. So I'm going to make a timeline up here at the top, which is what we had in the other one as well. Okay, another good one to have as a global variable would be a keyframe. So we can actually access each individual keyframe. Okay, I capitalized the F there because it's two words. Okay, Wesley asks, is anyone else's screen black? What you might do, Wesley, is go out and come back in. Okay, there's going to be some other variables up at the top as well, but we'll get to those as we're programming here. So these are the main ones that we're going to start with. If I click a Command-Shift-I, okay, it adds the imports for me up at the top of the class. Okay, so I have seconds elapsed, tick time in seconds. I have my delta, I have my timeline, and my keyframe. Let me zoom in here a little bit. Okay, bring up the font a little bit. Okay, and now remember, in a Java program, we have the constructor. Okay, the constructor is used to create an instance of that class. So I'm going to make a constructor. Constructor has the same name as the class. And it's used to initialize the variables. So it's used to set up the UI or set up the timer. So I'm going to have a constructor here. And when I create an instance of this analog stopwatch, the first thing I'm going to do is set up the UI. Okay, that's what the constructor is used for. It's used for initializing variables. In a JavaFX program, it's used to set up the UI. You're going to see I have an error there because I need to create that method. So I'm going to make a private method that doesn't return anything. It's going to set up our UI. Okay, so when I create an instance of our analog stopwatch class, this setup UI method is going to be called. What do we want to do? So the first thing we want to do is set up the root container. So remember, in a JavaFX, we have our stage, we have our scene, and we have the scene root. Okay, so we're going to set up a variable called a root container. And in our case, it's going to be a stack pane for our stopwatch. Okay, you're going to see two errors here. First one is I need to add the import. The second one is I actually need to create this variable. Okay, this variable is actually going to be a global variable. And what I like about NetBeans is it'll create it for you. So if I click this error, you can see the first one says add the import. Okay, so when I write root container equals new stack pane, and I click on the error message over here on the left on line 28, it's going to say add import for JavaFX scene. So I'm going to do that. First error goes away. If I click it again, it's going to say create local variable, create a field, or create a parameter. So I'm going to choose the second one, create a field in analog stopwatch. And you'll see here it actually adds that variable for me. Okay, I have a root container, it's a stack pane. Okay, so it'll write the code for me, but I'm going to separate it a little bit. I want these three variables together. I want my timeline and keyframe together. And then I want my UI variables together. Okay, and then in my stopwatch, we had the image views. So we had a dial image view. Okay, we had a dial image view. We also had a hand image view. Okay, same thing for these. I get two errors. If I click on line 32, line 33, I can add the import. Okay, but you're going to see two of them, and they're both JavaFX. So it may be better to do a Control-Shift-I here so you can see this better. The two imports are JavaFX scene, image, image view, and I have a JavaFX. It looks like JavaFX, but it's not. It's JavaX swing. text HTML image view. So we're going to want to pick the first one. Okay, JavaFX scene image view, and make sure it says JavaFX there. And then, like what we did for the other variables, I can click on the error and create a field. Okay, you're going to see it creates the field for me. It's also private, which is what we want. Okay, a few other things that we may want is to dynamically place the image. What we did before was we hard-coded the image. So what we can do in this case is actually have it as a variable. That way we don't have to go and look in the code. We can open up Analog Stopwatch, and if we want to change the images, we can just change them up at the top. So remember, we had image views. Inside the image view goes the image. So I have one here called the dial image. Okay, I'll create a new image. Okay, and this one's a little bit different. If I come back to the mystopwatch.java, I'll come back to this here in a second. If I come back to mystopwatch.java, you can just look at this. You'll see here we did a get class and then get resource as stream, and then we put the actual file name. Okay, that's what we need to do in here as well, but the file name is going to be dynamic. So come back to analog. We need to call get class, so get the current class, and then based off the current class, we'll get a resource as stream. So we're going to open up a file, and we're going to have the name of the file is dial image name. So everything's going to be dynamic here, no hard coding. Okay, if I click on the error, first thing we need to do is add the import. Okay, you're going to see a bunch of imports. I want to keep everything JavaFX, so it should be the first one. JavaFX.scene.image, the image class. Okay, if I click on the error again, I'm going to create a field for the dial image. If I click on the error again, I'm going to create a field for dial image name as well. Okay, so I have my image, which is dial image, and I also have my string, which is dial image name. Okay, hopefully you're not writing that code. Hopefully you're using NetBeans to write the code for you. And they have a lot of shortcuts that you can do. I know a lot of the getters and setters you can do. NetBeans will write the getters and setters for you. NetBeans will write some of the variables for you. Okay, just to save time, you'll want to use those shortcuts. The dial image name was our clock face. Okay, it was clockface.png. So now if I want to change this image, all I have to do is change it in my field. Okay, my global variable up at the top. I don't have to search through the code and find out where that dial image name is. Okay, I just have a variable. I can dynamically change it. We also need to make one for the hand image. Okay, so same thing, hand image equals new image. From the current class, we need to look for a file, and the file name is going to be hand image name. So if you go back to my stopwatch, you'll see the same thing. You'll see we did all this. The only difference is we had it all in the start method. So we had it all in the main, okay, like the main method. What we're doing now is we're separating into a class. Once we create an instance of the analog stopwatch, it's going to do the same thing and set up the UI. Okay, so I'll click on the error here on line 41. We're going to create a field for the hand image. Okay, so it says create field for hand image in the analog stopwatch class. Okay, when you reference a class, you always put the package name. So I'll click create field. There's my hand image. If I do create field for the hand image name, it's up there as well. Go ahead, Ling Yi. Go ahead, add some note. Okay, here I'm going to add the hand image name as well. Okay, before, if we go back to my stopwatch, it was called hand.png. Okay, so we have two images there. We have our dial image name and our hand image name. Okay, we want to make it more dynamic by making variables instead of putting the hard-coded strings in the code. The last thing we do is we actually add that to our image views. Okay, so we have our dial image view. If you go back and look at the code, we did what's called a set image. Okay, we put our dial image in the dial image view, as well as our hand image. Okay, our hand image view, we need to set the image as well, which is our hand image. Okay, Alan has a good pointer in the chat. It says if you'd like, you can do Alt-Enter or Alt-Return to open up the error menu. Instead of going over there and clicking, you can do the shortcut Alt-Enter, and it'll open up the error menu for you. Okay, get used to these shortcuts. They'll save a lot of time when writing the code. The very last thing, so we have to add the image to the image view, which is what we just did. And then you have to add the image view to your root. So here I have my root container. And I will do a get children, since it's a stack pane. And I'll do an add all. I'll add the dial image view and the hand image view. Okay, we'll add the dial image view first because we want it to be on the bottom. And then we add the hand image view so it'll be on top of it. Okay, so now, instead of having everything in the main, we put it in a function. We have a setup UI function. We call it in the constructor, but it could be called elsewhere as well. Okay, we can call it elsewhere as well. We can call it, let's say, in a method. Maybe we want to change the UI later. Okay, we can call this and change the UI later. So that's the benefit of putting it in a method. Okay, I can call it in the constructor. I can call it elsewhere. So I can reuse the code easier. Okay, the next one that you're going to want to do after we get set up the UI done, we also need to set up the timer. Okay, so we have set up UI. We also need to set up the timer. So I'm going to put that in my constructor. Every time I create an instance, it's going to set the UI up. It's going to create a stack pane. It's going to create image views. I'm going to put images in the image view and add them to the root. I also need to set up my timer. So the constructor is going to call two methods. Okay, and here's the two methods. In setup timer, okay, I just set up the timeline. I set up the timeline by creating a keyframe. I add that keyframe in the timeline's constructor. and then I just set the cycle count to infinite. Okay, I'll come back to this code. I'm going to go back to my stopwatch.java. That's what we did down here. Okay, we have a timeline. In the timeline's constructor was a keyframe. The keyframe needed the duration and what property to change. So we're going to set this up in a method. Okay, so if I come back, here's my setup timer method. So it's going to take a keyframe. Keyframe was the global variable defined up at the top. And we're going to create a new instance of our keyframe class. Keyframe took two parameters. One was the duration in milliseconds. It could be in others too. It could be nanoseconds, whatever you want. And you're going to see here, instead of hard coding it, I'm actually going to multiply it by the tick time in seconds so I can make my hand move smoothly if I would like. So whatever I set the tick time in seconds to be, it's also going to update the seconds elapsed, but also update how often this keyframe gets called. So I have tick time in seconds here, and I'll multiply that by 1,000. So earlier, we just had 1,000 hard-coded. Okay, now our keyframe can also be more dynamic, okay, based off a multiplier. So whatever I set the tick time in seconds to be, it's not only going to affect the seconds elapsed, but also going to affect how quickly the keyframe is called. Okay, the second parameter was an action event. And this is a lambda expression. So what I like to do is set it all up in one line. Set it all up in one line so you can see what that one line looks like. So I have a keyframe, which is our constructor. Takes two parameters. One is the duration. The second parameter is a function, okay, which we're going to use our lambda expression here. If I do a Command-Shift-I, we're going to need to add these imports. Okay, so when I click Command-Shift-I, it defaults to JavaFX, both of them. You'll see JavaFX.event.actionEvent and JavaFX.util.duration. Those are the ones we want, so I'll click on OK. Okay, now I have no errors. So once this line's set up and you see what it actually looks like, I'll usually separate these mustaches out. Okay, I'll separate these mustaches onto a new line. Okay, here we had some code. We had seconds elapsed plus equals tick time in seconds, so we had our formula. I can write the formula again, or I can put it in a method. We'll call it update. Because maybe we want to call this update elsewhere. So in update, it was seconds elapsed plus equals tick time in seconds. So this is our formula that we came up with in the videos. Okay, then that was calculate for our rotation. Our rotation was equal to our seconds elapsed multiplied by our angle. And then we actually updated the hand image view. We did a set rotate so we can rotate it from our rotation. So every time you have a little snippet of code, instead of writing that code in many different places, put it in a method and make a method call. Okay, that's a better way to program. Maybe I want to call update in the keyframe. Maybe I also want to call update somewhere else. Instead of writing these 3 lines twice, I can write them once and just make a method call. Okay, after this, in the My Stopwatch.java, we actually combine the keyframe and the timeline together. We're actually separating them here. We need to put that in the timelines parameter. So I have my timeline up at the top. By separating them, I have a little bit more control. I can access that keyframe later if I need to. Before, we didn't have an object. We created instance of keyframe, but it was right in the timelines parameter. Okay, so I couldn't access keyframe later, but now I can, since I actually created an object. So we put that in the timeline, and then we set the timeline to be infinite. So I do a set cycle count. That's an animation. I set it to infinite so it keeps going. Can everybody hear me? Okay, Joseph said he can't hear me. Let's see, Joseph said, okay, there's two Josephs. Let's see. Okay, Jonah. Not sure what happened. Sometimes the internet connection's bad, and the Zoom may freeze a little bit, but if you have an okay internet connection, it should do well. Okay, let's see here. So we're doing a lot of things here, and we're doing it quickly, but we're separating the code out. Instead of putting it all in the main, I'm making methods. I could have wrote these 3 lines of code inside the keyframe, but put it in a method so I may be able to call it later. Okay, so I'm setting up the timer by creating a keyframe. Okay, remember the timeline was the start and the stop point, and each keyframe was the individual points in between the start and the end point. So the timeline is the whole thing, and every time a keyframe happens, which would be here, every 1 second, I'm adding a notch on the timeline. So you can think of a timeline as an amount of time. Okay, every keyframe is each individual point as I'm going through the timeline. Okay, so every 1 second, I'm going to call this update method. The update method increments the seconds elapsed and multiplies that by our angle, and then sets the rotation on our hand image view. Okay, which is what we had before. The only difference here is we're making a Java application now. We're separating it out. We're making functions. Some other methods that we'll need is a public method to return the root container. That way I can put it in the scene. I could return a stack pane here, but I can also do what's called parent. And I'll show you why. So I make a method called getRootContainer. It's going to return our root container. I may have spelled that wrong. getRootContainer with an A. Return root container. Our root container was actually a stack pane. But what I can do here, I can use the superclass. Okay, I can use the superclass, which is parent. Okay, I need to add the import here. Add import for JavaFX.scene.parent. And why I'm doing this is maybe the root container is not a stack pane. Maybe the root container is a grid pane, or maybe it's a VBox. If I put parent here, it doesn't matter what the root container is. I'm using a generic type, so I can return all the root containers. If I put stack pane here, then I can only return stack pane, so I'm being very specific. Sometimes it's good to be general, so it doesn't matter what the root container is, I can return it. So this method is more flexible. The other thing we did was we dynamically set the height and width of the scene. So I'm having these methods here so I can create my scene in the main class. The other thing we may need is to get the height and width of the dial image, is what we did before. So I'll create methods for them. Okay, I'll create a get width method. Basically, if there's a dial image, so if the dial image does not equal null, okay, I could write brackets like this and do a return. Okay, we did a get width before in the MyStopwatch.java. In the MyStopwatch previous example, we get the width of the image. But if it's null, then we're going to return 0.0. Because if it's null and I try to get the width, the program will throw an error. Okay, so I need to make sure it's not null. But you'll see here, writing this if-else statement is now 6 lines of code. I'm going to do a shorthand for the get height. And you probably can do this in other languages as well. But if the if statement only contains one line, I don't need to have brackets. So I can do something like this. If hand image, or sorry, this is still dial image. If dial image does not equal null, I can return dial image dot get height. Else, return 0.0. So if the if and else only have one line, I don't need to add those mustaches. Okay, I don't need to add those brackets. I can just say if and then return immediately. Else, return immediately. So when you're in a job interview, you can do the brackets, which looks nice. But if you know these shorthands that saves a lot of lines of code, they're going to look at that. They're going to see, okay, this person has experience. They know I don't need those brackets. It's a waste of space. But if I have more than one line of code in the if statement, then I do need brackets. So the interviews, let's say for Google, they're all going to be looking for things like this. Because an experienced programmer would know I don't need that. Okay, so you want to learn the little tricks of Java. The other thing is we had a start method. Okay, when they click the button, we want to play the timeline. Okay, so maybe instead of writing timeline.play many places in the code, I can create a start method. The start method just says timeline.play. Okay, so I can call this start method in many different places. You may want a stop method as well that does timeline.pause or timeline.stop. But we don't need it just yet. The last method we're going to write today is to set the tick time in seconds. So I'll make a public method. It's set tick time in seconds. It's kind of a long method name there. It takes a double. So it's going to take a tick time in seconds. We're going to set that variable. Okay, so I use the this keyword. Remember, this references the current object. Okay, so it's referencing the class field. And the one without the this is referencing the parameter. Okay, so I'm referencing the current object, setting the global variable or the class field, and I'm taking the parameter and assigning it to that class field. So Alan asks, making the method, it doesn't seem like it's much shorter. Why would we do that? Trey says timeline is private, so we have to use a public function. That's correct. But also, let's say we did timeline play in many different places. So let's say they click the button, it plays. And let's say when they click the play button, so let's say when they run the program, we also want it to play. Instead of writing that line of code twice, we make a method. So anytime that you're going to see a line of code written twice, you should know I need to make a method for that. Instead of calling timeline.play twice, you just call the start method. Because if I ever need to change that line of code, now I need to change it in 2 places. Whereas in this way, I only have to change timeline.play once, because then I call the start method in both places. So for changes, it makes it easier. And then Trey has a good point as well, is the timeline is private, so we can't access it anywhere outside of this class. So this would be our public, so this would be our data encapsulation. Anytime you want to play the timeline, you have to call our method. So it also makes it more secure. In this case, we're not looking for anything, we're just playing the timeline, but we could say, if start is called in these specific classes, only play it, which could prevent hacking. In this case, we may not need to prevent hacking, but that's a good example of why we would want to make it private. For the set tick time in seconds, we're changing the tick time in seconds in this timeline. So this timeline is going to be playing. Okay, it's going to be playing. And basically, we want to reset the timeline. So I cannot change this timeline while it's playing. So if I change this set tick time in seconds, we also need to call setup timer again. And that's why I made a method. Okay, instead of just writing all that code in the constructor, once we change tick time in seconds, we need to call setup timer again, because we cannot change that timeline while it's playing. If we change the timeline while it's played, we're going to get some funky results. Okay, let's see here. Quick double check. Does the parent means return type is the parent class? So if I go up to, let's see, where is that? So if I go up to my root container, let's see, where's the stack pane? So if I click on this stack pane constructor here, so in setup UI, I create a new stack pane instance. If I do a show Java doc, what you'll see here is, I'll go up to the top. You'll see here this class stack pane. Okay, you'll see class stack pane. The superclass of all classes is object. Then we have JavaFX node, and then we have JavaFX parent. So parent, so this you can see it's a hierarchy because it's tabbed out. So object is a superclass, then node, then parent, then region, then pane, and then stack pane. So if I want to handle not only all panes, you can see what all the panes are: anchor pane, border pane, grid pane, HBox, VBox. So if I want to handle more than just the panes, maybe I want to handle region as well, then I would do parent. If I only want to handle all the panes, I could have returned the pane superclass. So basically, parent is a superclass of region, pane, and stack pane, since it goes up the hierarchy. So really, I could have used any of these superclasses. These are all superclasses. So pane is a superclass of stack pane, region is a superclass of pane, and parent is a superclass of region. So it depends on how generic you want to be. Maybe pane is sufficient. In this case, we're going to use parent, which is a few nodes up the hierarchy. Okay, good question. At this point, I have enough to actually run this code. Okay, I actually have enough, so I have my start method. I have my get height, get width. I have my set tick time in seconds, so I'm going to come back to my main class. So in the start method, we need to create an instance of our analog stopwatch. So I have my analog stopwatch class. I need to create an instance. Let's say it's called analog equals new analog stopwatch. So I'm in the main class. I'm creating an instance. And I need to use those methods to set the scene. So I need to create a new scene instance. First one is the root container. So I'll call my analog instance. I'll do the dot notation. I have one called get root container. The next one is the width. So I'll call my analog get width. And then the last one is analog dot get height. Okay, so I have my analog stopwatch. Remember, when I create the instance, it's going to call setup UI and setup timer. As soon as I run this line of code here on line 22, it's going to call those two methods. It's going to set up the UI. It's going to set up the timer. And then after the UI is set up, I can get the root container and also get the height and get the width. So I'll set the title. I will set the scene. So make sure you uncomment that line out. And I'll pass in the scene that we just created. I'll show the stage. And then I also need to set the tick time in seconds. So I'll say analog. I'll do a set tick time in seconds. Let's say I set it to 1.0, which is what we had before. And then here I can call analog dot start to actually start that timeline. Okay, so if I click run, it's coming over here. So here's my running clock. Okay, I can change the tick time in seconds. So let's say I change it to 0.1. Let's see what that looks like. So now, when the clock's running, you'll see it's very smooth. Instead of clicking from second to second, it's going to move very smoothly if I change the tick time in seconds. Okay, there's another bonus opportunity. The problem is it needs to be done before the next class because we're going to go over the solution. Let's say if I start the clock, so let's say I put it to 0.1 and then later I want to change it to 1.0. Okay, this is what's going to happen. And actually that's running really slow. It may be because I'm running Zoom, but usually it goes really crazy. It just goes really fast. And let me switch these two. Maybe I need to switch these two. That's actually pretty slow. I'm surprised it's that slow. Let me switch these two. Let me switch these two and run it. Okay, now it's not doing it at all. But usually, if I switch it, the clock goes crazy. Okay, it'll go super fast. So I want you to figure out what's wrong with this clock. We're running out of time. So go ahead and put your attendance in the on the chat. Put your name and paw print in the chat so I can get you in attendance. I will upload the recording. Let's see here. So our start method, would it make sense to maybe have a Boolean variable like running or something for future if statements? Alan, that's a good question. We're actually going to make a method called isRunning. here in a few lectures, and we're going to see if that animation is running or not. Boolean variable would work, but we have another way that we can do it as well. Okay, put your name and popper in the chat. I'll upload the video here soon. I'll upload the code as well. Then try to see what's going wrong with this code. Try to fix this code and find out what the error is. Trying to set tick time in seconds and find out what's wrong with this thing. Okay, that's all for today. We will see you in class on Wednesday. See you next time.